Okay, so this is the final video in the presidency lecture videos. But again, this none of it what's on here is going to be on the exam. So I want to be clear about that. I'm not suggesting that you turn off the video. I hope you haven't turned it off already as soon as you heard that. But I do want to offer a little bit more nuance about presidential signing statements, but I'm not going to be asking about that on the exam. There are times when presidential signing statements are actually understandable and they're a good thing. In fact, they're a way of maintaining the balance between the branches. So if you actually click on President Obama's first signing statement, you'll see that some of the things he wrote in the signing statement are actually an attempt to find or maintain the balance. And I don't think these kinds of signing statements are necessarily problematic, although there's a part of me that feels like the appropriate thing to do would be to simply veto a bill and tell Congress, I'm not signing it with these things included. But oftentimes presidents don't feel like they can do that, so now they resort to signing statements. So sometimes there'll be presidential signing statements in response to efforts on the part of Congress to encroach on executive authority. In other words, sometimes Congress tries to push back against presidential authority, and they do so in a way that really does overstep their bounds. They go into places where the courts and precedent and tradition suggest that these are areas that are controlled by the president. So for example, if you look at that signing statement that President Obama wrote, in one of them, one of his objections to the bill was there was something in the bill that limited the president's ability to negotiate international agreements. The Congress tried to put some constraints on him. And the courts have said that the president is the sole voice of the nation in foreign affairs. That is an executive authority. And so in the signing statement, one of the things President Obama writes is he basically says he's going to instruct the Secretary of State and the people working in the executive branch to take this as advisory, right? There's another one in this particular signing statement where Congress allocated money generally for something. And basically what they wrote is that when the president decides specifically what he wants to spend the money on, that he has to go back to Congress and get the approval of the committee that signed the bill. Congress can't do that. They either allocate the money and say where it's going to be spent or they don't, but they can't require the president to go back. And so President Obama wrote it in the signing statement, you can't do that, and I'm not gonna be bound by that. And then there was another part in the bill where Congress basically tried to limit any kind of claim of executive privilege. Executive privilege is this broad concept, this idea that when people give advice to the president can keep that advice secret, essentially. The idea being this, that when someone comes to give the president advice, if they're worried that their advice to the president is going to become public, they may not be totally honest about what they think. And so there's been an understanding that presidents can claim executive privilege over certain kinds of advice. This way we know that they'll get people's advice and people will say exactly what they think, not worrying about what happens if somebody finds out what I said. Now, executive privilege doesn't protect advice if that advice is to do something illegal, right? You can't claim executive privilege if you've been advising the president on doing something illegal. But when you're just giving advice on policy, you can. So in this bill, there was an effort to sort of limit any claims of executive privilege, and Obama wrote something out rejecting that as well. This is okay. This is that normal negotiation between Congress and the president. And so it is more nuanced. I don't want you to think that all presidential signing statements are necessarily bad. That's an oversimplification. But the somewhat controversial ones are kind of bad, right? But Congress can respond to them. The very controversial presidential signing statements are really problematic, and that's why I focus on that as well. So I just wanted to add that nuance. In a way, if this doesn't make sense to you, it's not that big of a deal, but you can always ask me on the discussion board, and I'm happy to elaborate on it because it's kind of a complex thing. So don't hesitate. If you want to know more about it, you can either come to office hours, or you can post something on the discussion board, or you can email me directly. And so the last part that I want to talk about is the imbalance between presidential power and public expectations. I've talked about the power of the presidency and how it has grown tremendously. I've talked about how presidents do far more than what the framers of the Constitution ever anticipated presidents doing. And I said in an earlier video that if we could reanimate the framers, if we could bring them back to life, and then they saw our political system, they'd be like, man, we screwed up. We tried to make sure that you didn't have a king, and you clearly have a king. They would look at how much power presidents have, in part because Congress has given them additional power, but they would see how much power presidents have, and they would think, man, that's scary. So presidents have a ton of power. At the same time, the way things work, and we'll talk about this more in other videos, what people expect presidents to be able to do and what they hold them accountable for is kind of nonsense. When there's a lot of inflation, they'll blame the president, right? If the presidents could control inflation, we would never have inflation. If the economy gets bad, they'll blame the president. Now, if the president could adjust a dial and, set the economy to bad or the economy to be good, they would set the economy to good, especially right before an election. They'd be like, hey, let's make the economy good. Presidents don't have that much control. And yet, when the economy's bad, we blame the president, whether or not the president can control it. When the economy's doing well, we credit the president, whether or not the president, even though the president can't control it. It's a really simplistic understanding of the way the world works. So the truth is that our economy is driven by a bunch of global forces, some of which we can control and some of which we can't. Like, for example, the pandemic. When the pandemic happened, it took a huge hit on the economy, took a huge hit. There's nothing President Trump originally or President Biden later or whoever follows them could have done anything about the hit that the economy was going to take when a pandemic, a global pandemic, happened. When there were disruptions in the 2022, 2021 in the global supply chain, right? As the pandemic hurt China and it hurt other parts of the country. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, which the economy took another hit. There's nothing a president can do about those kinds of things. And yet we typically blame the president when things are going poorly, and we credit the president when things are going well. And it's incredibly simplistic and not very accurate. And so if nothing else, now that you know what Congress does, and now you know what the president does, I hope you'll have a more nuanced view when it comes time to evaluate what a president is doing. It's not just what's the economy like. It's what has the president done, and what has Congress done, and what is happening globally. And then you can assess whether or not the person who's in office deserves to be booted out or to be reelected. But this kind of simplistic idea that when things are going well, the president gets all the credit, and when things are going poorly, the president gets all the blame, is really kind of a silly way of thinking about things, and it doesn't match up with what presidents are able to do. What we expect them to be able to do and what they're actually able to do is completely out of whack. And so I just hope you'll keep that in mind the next time there's a presidential election and you're trying to evaluate whomever the incumbent is. Don't just ask yourself, how are things going right now? Ask yourself, how are things going right now? And what part of this can the president control and not control? What part of this is Congress's responsibility? What part of this is the interaction between the two of them? What part of this is global forces that no president or Congress can control for that matter? To take a more nuanced view is basically what I'm recommending that everybody do. But since I can only talk to you because you're taking my class and the rest of the world doesn't take my class, I'm just going to impart that on you and use that information as you see fit. And this ends the lecture videos on the presidency.